Hello? Okay. Good afternoon. Buenos tardes. We begin the EuroLat meeting with civil society. A small point that is not on the agenda for those who might leave a little earlier from this meeting. The bus for the dinner will leave 7:45, not 8, which is on the agenda. The bus for the dinner from the hotel. So 7:45. Okay. Now, I thank everybody for being here. I know it's afternoon and some of us had a long lunch, but now we have, I think, maybe the very interesting topic, this strange animal we call civil society, which can fit many, many, many concepts and definitions, from large, well-organized NGOs to small organizations run by 2 people. And most of us who have joined the European Parliament or from Latin America are very familiar, and some of us have come from that world, directly out of the civil society. I appreciate the presence of the invited speakers, Ms. Olga Baus-Gibert, Dumitru Fornea, who has the good expertise that he also speaks Greek. So, Ms. Andrea Costafreda, Jorge Fonseca Castro, Mr. Joseph Puxeu, I hope I say that right, and Ms. Marta Scarpato. I thank the members of the European and Latin American Diplomatic Corps, institutions of the European Union, other personalities, of course, the translators. I welcome the representatives of the European Economic and Social Committee, who will have a good chance to explain and I think are very important in the role of the Europarlament to make the connection between society and the institutions. Because this meeting is held in the European Union, the organization is run by the European component, and the interpretation is in the typical languages. It's also being web streamed. So let's go to our first point, which is to adopt the draft agenda, which you have, which is the typical thing, and I'm guessing there's no disagreements, so no objections. We adopt the agenda for the discussion today. We approve then the minutes of the last meeting where I was not myself. This is my first participation in EuroLat as I'm a relatively new member. So the meeting of the 1st of December in Brussels, they're included in your dossier. And if there's no modifications, you can make them by the end of the meeting if you like. So we approve them as they stand, and there's some time still. And now my good colleague Sandra Jasna Provoste has a chance to talk.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Nikos. Estimados y estimadas.
Thank you very much, Nikos, dear colleagues. The time we have this afternoon is limited, unfortunately, but I hope it will be enough for us to be able to get through all the items on the agenda that we plan to discuss, and in order for us to be able to have a smooth debate and to run it efficiently, we've suggested the following breakdown of time. Our guests would have a maximum of 8 minutes for their initial remarks. Each one will have then 3 minutes or so to give concluding remarks and respond to questions. And as far as the members are concerned, a maximum of 2 minutes. And please stick to your speaking time, members, because it is absolutely imperative that we do that because of the shortage of time for the meeting. We just can't overrun because we have other plans later on. We need to finish on time, and we do want to get through all the items that we have on the agenda. We want to be able to have a comprehensive discussion of them all. So we would ask you extremely kindly, please, to stick to your 2 minutes speaking time. I don't know if anyone has any comments at this juncture. If not, then I would just start by highlighting how important this EuroLat meeting is to all of us. As has been said previously, it's taking place a week after the EU-CELAC most recent summit, and this highlighted the need for us to work ever more closely together, to come together on a bi-regional basis and to work as closely as possible, because there is now a window of opportunity for us to develop and intensify our cooperation, both at governmental and society level. In Article 34 of the Declaration, the role of parliamentary democracy is specifically mentioned, and our role as a bilateral parliamentary assembly is, of course, an integral part of that. This is, of course, the CELAC Declaration. We've included the message in our file, that is to say, the message that we sent to CELAC summit, and also the declaration that was adopted at the summit. That's also in your file. So without further ado, I shall now hand the floor back to my colleague.
We have quite a large title, which includes two main things: exchange of views on the reduction of inequalities to promote sustainable development and the strengthening of democracies in Latin America, Caribbean, and the European Union. So that title is Inequalities, Sustainable Development, and Democracies, which are three topics which are interrelated and interconnected, but each one we could probably talk about for a long time. The COVID-19, dear colleagues, the pandemic and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and the ensuing food security, energy crisis, and soaring inflation have, as we all know, increased inequality in many countries, both in Europe and in Latin America. The mounting inequalities have led to a scenario of social emergency with dire consequences, especially for the most vulnerable groups: women, children, indigenous people, and low-income households. I think we all know that. And Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world. And instead of getting better, here we are. I think these meetings are precisely so that we can find ways to reverse that trend. We have unbalanced power relations that favor the few against the majority. We need, obviously, a strengthening of democracy to help that case. The unfair tax systems that always seem to exist, not only in, I would say, Latin America, but Europe has its escape clauses as well for the super wealthy. Inequality is thus a permanent challenge. And additionally, European countries are currently facing economic and social recovery challenges due to the pandemic, the consequences of the war, and I would also say due to the climate crisis. And if you read it all, the EU CELAC and Javi Lopez discussed it briefly this morning. One of the points is that there should be, and that was also discussed yesterday, one of the points is that there should be some debt relief for countries that are particularly hit hard, because at the time that we're trying to save a country from either a hurricane, an earthquake, or a devastating fire, or anything else that's coming our way, to ask those countries to keep up the exact same debt repayment is an enormous burden that has been proposed by CELAC to find a way to reduce that. I think that's one of the most difficult things, that we have to follow the same debt repayment schedule in those countries. And I come from Greece, which had a similar crisis, so we understand what that's about. Household living standards have deteriorated around half of EU countries. The median disposable income in real terms has fallen by 2 percentage points. And that's why we say the crisis has been most acutely felt by low-income households. We have many workers who don't have sufficient wages. We have this new activity of employment, which is the so-called gig economy. I don't know how that's translated into Spanish. In other words, uninsured, paid very low, and it's a whole new economy which is supposed to help the consumer, but it doesn't seem to be helping the people who work there around the globe, I would say. And as an example, in Greece, they banned Uber as a gig economy, as being unfair to the worker. And just to add something, during the heat wave, also they banned all delivery, so that people don't boil in the 45, 46 degree weather with their little motorcycles, which I think is a sign of exactly what the policies our friends are going to discuss are supposed to fight. Given this situation, the new EuroLat momentum is an opportunity to discuss the role of bi-regional cooperation and how it can contribute to reducing inequality. Civil society and local authorities have a crucial role, and can contribute from several areas to find approaches that bring value to the high-level discussions. At the EuroLat Forum, which was organized to give civil society and local authorities a space ahead of the EU-CELAC summit, that was 2 weeks ago on Thursday and Friday in Brussels, there was a debate on inequalities in Latin America and the Caribbean and the EU, how to transition towards more inclusive and equal societies in LAC and the EU was held, and I spoke there, and I think Mr. Forné was there, and some others were here. Olga, yes, you were there, and one of the points was about reform of the tax system, and the EU does have proposals on transition to improve, to bring in the proper people who are not connected with, well, with the oligarchs. When a poor person who's getting a salary of 500 euros has a fine on a rich person of 10 million, who is going to win that game in a country with weaker institutions? So I have many things I would like to add, but in the time that we have, I want to give the floor for 8 minutes for each of our speakers. We start with Olga Bauzibero. She is Deputy Head of Unit, DG INPA, Central America, Mexico, Caribbean, and the European Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you very much indeed for your invitation. It's a great honor for me to be able to participate in the proceedings of the Assembly yesterday and today. We're focusing on inequality, and the work I do is on the green transition and the sustainable development. And during all the discussions that we've had, it's clear that the digital transition and the green transition and inclusion all go hand in hand. The green and the digital transitions have to be just transitions, because otherwise we're not going to reduce the inequalities that there are. We're not going to be able to tackle climate change. And these are really the massive challenges which lie ahead for society, which it has to address as a pressing matter. A week ago, the summit took place and it reached some very successful conclusions. One of the agreements was on investments under the heading Global Gateway. There's been quite a lot of discussion about that already. But I think this is a new model, it's a new roadmap, and it's the way the European Union is trying to structure its investment in a more comprehensive way so that it can help to address some very complex issues across society. The Global Gateway strategy was adopted about a year ago by the Commission, the intention being to try to leverage private investment and private-public partnerships to the benefit of society as a whole. The idea is of course, to try to see how we can translate that into practical cooperation and collaboration. The Global Gateway Investment Agenda was adopted during the summit, and it will be implemented in the foreseeable future. This is a practical roadmap for how we can actually implement the Global Gateway and how we can actually put into practice this new model of cooperation which we wish to create. There are 130 projects contained in this roadmap. Most of them are individual projects. There are some identified on a country-by-country basis, and then there are some initiatives which are more regional or perhaps some regional, and there are some which are to be rolled out with Team Europe. And this means that there will be a number of actors who will have to come together and agree. These are initiatives. These are quite a number of representative projects which we think will be an excellent area of cooperation across the two regions. The list is, of course, not exhaustive. It's a dynamic list, constantly evolving, and of course it will evolve further as we continue with dialogue between the two regions. So we'll be looking at the recommendations from civil society, from youth, from local authorities, for example, to see what we should be doing. The forum, which took place in the run-up to the summit itself, came up with some useful recommendations. So we'll be looking at how to integrate those into our roadmap. We have essentially designed a new paradigm in the shape of this Global Gateway, and the idea is that we should be channeling assistance for development in a positive way to guarantee the transformation in society that's necessary. We want to leverage investment with the private sector and involve the public and private sectors in joint ventures. We want the volumes to be considerable, and we want them to be successful projects that deliver added value and are productive for the most vulnerable people and groups of society in particular. So that's the overall goal. If you were to take a look at the list of the investment projects, and it was published, if you look at it, you'll see that there's some good infographics on the council pages, which are quite illustrative, and you'll see that these are infrastructure projects. They're projects which are very wide-ranging, and there's a circular approach underpinning them. So, for example, if there's a green hydrogen project to be implemented in a particular country and European countries are interested in investing, then the structure of the paradigm is such that there are 3 levels of dialogue: EU, private sector, and groups from civil society, which might be interested in the topic. So that over and above the actual infrastructure investment, there will be some clarity as to what the accompanying measures should be, what else needs to be done to ensure that this project covers all bases, ticks all boxes, leaves nobody behind, and actually does develop the capacities, the opportunities and the facilities which the people of the area or the country need. For example, for young people to get decent jobs. So there are a number of complementary cross-cutting goals, and ultimately we want to enhance the future and the prospects of young people and society as a whole in all these countries. So that's the way these projects are structured. Most of them focus on things like energy, transformation, transition, decarbonising, climate change, smart mobility, for example, metro developments, electric buses. And of course, it's very interesting to look at the last mile in the public sector budgeting. What's really interesting to us is to address the last mile or last kilometre of the connectivity, because that's what's important to the vulnerable communities, and that's what we need to look at and where we need to resolve a number of problems, because some of the basic services which should be supplied to the people of a country are actually not accessible to the people who are slightly further away or in slightly more remote areas. I know I've been talking at some length already, so with an eye on the clock, I don't want to go on too long, but the point is we're also trying to tie investment in with the agenda, the social agenda, because that's really, really important. So the European Union has a major political stake here. It's a big commitment for us, and the objective is, as I've said, to make sure that we structure all this investment properly. When we met with civil society prior to the summit, we announced that we would be investing €6 million in order to provide ancillary support for all the social and economic policy measures which would be required to guarantee the successful implementation of this roadmap. So there would be new strands to the policies which we haven't seen before. So we're really wanting to design what we might call a social accelerator to make sure that we've got, yes, public sector policies that do address gender issues, for example, or promote the interests of youth, but we want to create a real social accelerator, as we're calling it, which is going to create connections across society and make sure that the most vulnerable communities and parts of society can benefit. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for your presentation, especially the last part, which is something that concerns me, how we get to those weaker parts of society with institutions. So you answered that, and I want to continue now. Dimitri Fornea, European Economic Social Committee, Latin America Follow-up Committee, Domestic Advisory Group for Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Rapporteur on the Global Gateway for EESC.
Ευχαριστώ, Mr. President Papandreou. Gracias, señora Provafoste. Thank you very much indeed. Well, for us, the Economic and Social Committee of the European Union is a very valuable body, and we're always glad that the ESC is involved in the work of EuroLat and in the work of the Joint Parliamentary Assembly. We have worked on the Global Gateway. I've prepared a presentation, a dynamic presentation. We can quickly look at the civil society perspective. We are concerned about the Belt and Road Initiative from China. Now, we very much hope that we will be able to say that things aren't as simple as creating strategic interdependence. And we're going to try and explain why things aren't as simple as they might seem. The Chinese are investing heavily since 2013 worldwide. But the way that they do it is different to what we would like to see. So far, it's been over $1 trillion. So trillions of dollars being invested in generally construction projects in Africa, Latin America, in some cases, some in Asia as well, and in Eastern Europe. And a lot of this investment goes into fossil fuels. So that's not something that we agree with. They have quite an aggressive narrative that goes down quite well in many parts of the world, and many countries seem to be persuaded that this is the right way forward. But I'm going to try and explain with my slides that by 2027 they're going to try and invest $1.2 trillion, excuse me. And so, but there's a lot still left to invest. We've got 389 billion in the Global Gateway. So let's look at the map of which countries we're talking about. The situation has been improving for those countries and worsening for us. But they had this very centralized idea. The idea was to integrate China with the markets that were of interest. Interesting, Latin America wasn't necessarily at the core of this strategy, but it's become part of the strategy. And we'll send you all the slides. There are many African leaders who are politically supporting Chinese policies and spreading propaganda. Looking at the statements from the Prime Minister of Egypt, for example, he's very positive and complimentary of the Chinese initiatives. Now the initiative is growing. The Belt and Road Initiative of the Global Development Initiative for Global Security and Global Civilization. So it keeps getting expanded. Now, however, in 2015, the Japanese launched a counter-offensive, and they launched a proposal that's more directed at Asian countries, and they do have ambitions for other parts of the world, including Latin America. So it's important to bear in mind that these initiatives do exist. The Western world in 2021 also dedicated some attention to with the Build Back Better World initiative, trying to do something. The Americans were lagging behind a little bit. We don't know quite what they're intending to do. But it seems that they're going to relaunch this whole issue. And that they will release some investment for global development. Now, the G7 initiative falls under the Global Gateway. We've got climate, values, bank financing. All of these issues fall under the G7 initiative. The UK has also launched another initiative that's a bit smaller, but it might very well work for the Anglo-Saxon sphere and countries that have a close connection with the Crown and with that region. So that's yet another model. Let's come back to the European Union initiative, which is the main initiative that's around at the moment, and it's the main tool for international development cooperation. And we have to support it, and we have to understand it for what it is, not for what others might believe it should be or ought to be. These are the components that make up the strategy. And we've heard people asking, well, where is civil society in all this? Good governance and transparency, that's been mentioned. Well, in some way or another, civil society must be involved, and it should be as representative as possible for those regions where projects are being implemented. Now, we do know that in the EU-African Union Summit of the 17th and 18th of February 2022, 150 billion euros were released for Africa. We knew that a week before that it was about 45 billion in euros that were announced for Latin America by President Ursula von der Leyen. And we know that different projects were being proposed, different thematic projects, which would bring about a leveraging effect, and in this way attract further investment. In the committee, we have supported these proposals. We supported the Global Gateway, and we actually published an opinion on this, and we made our recommendations, saying that we should go beyond critical infrastructure and that we needed to streamline bureaucracy and cut red tape as much as possible. Now, of course, there are certain requirements that derive from EU law, and we also stress the importance of fundamental rights, human rights, and the social and environmental impact assessment, and compliance with transparency regulations. All of these are values that we cannot make compromises on. Generally speaking, most countries in Latin America already are signed up to the ethical principles that we require. Many of our interlocutors have already signed up to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and UN conventions on human rights and the sustainability objectives. We all know this. Now, I'm from the trade union movement. I'm from Romania, from a trade union, and I participate in this capacity in the Economic and Social Committee in the workers' component. And so this is, as such, I think the role of the ILO is very important. Now, we know that nobody just wants to rely on the sale of raw materials alone, but we all know that raw materials will be needed. And so that's going to be needed for the development of new technologies, mobile phones, for example. Every citizen will need some sort of mobile phone device, and AI is going to be developed further. We know this is ongoing, and this will mean that there's going to be ever more Internet of Things, Internet of multiple technologies, and all of this is going to require energy. Energy, which ultimately means that you have to have raw materials to create them. Now, e-mobility, for example, that's interesting to see how in Madrid it's working. Yes, I am wrapping up, Chairman. So all of these are things that we're going to take into account with the internalization of external costs in Africa, for example, the impact on water resources. And in our policies, we talked about the Digital Alliance, the different projects that are ongoing. The Beja, for example, already committed. We've got the Clara network as well, which I can only recommend wholeheartedly for Latin American friends to look into that. So millions of euros that are already allocated. So to conclude, it's very important that we support organized civil society in Latin American countries. and that we involve representative bodies. In the last forum, there weren't any representative bodies from employers or trade unions in Latin American countries, whether it's Colombia, Ecuador, or elsewhere. That was a shortcoming, but anyway, it was a success nevertheless, because we did have different actors and different players involved. But in future, we will need to ensure that our values and the idea of representative nature of this is taken into account. We've got councils in Argentina, in Honduras, and we have a strong international framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll have a chance in the discussion to allow you to expand a little bit. I know I forced it to go fast. Now we have from Oxfam Intermon, Program Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, Andrea Costafreda. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, presidente, presidenta.
Thank you very much indeed. Chairman, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today, meeting with legislators. Oxfam is, of course, only one of the other civil society organizations that participated in the summit in the meeting before the CELAC summit. And it's very interesting for us to have an exchange of views with you from a critical point of view about what the implications of the CELAC are and what the content of the declaration is. Javi Lopez was quite optimistic about the fact that it should deliver a higher level of participation, that it was effective, and that it should achieve a more horizontal relationship with more input from Latin America, more attention to, and a more listening approach than there has necessarily been at an intergovernmental and state level. After 8 years of a desert in terms of CELAC summits, civil society still continued in that vacuum to keep in touch with our counterparts, to work hard, to focus, and to try to develop the relationships between Latin America and the EU. And so we're glad to see the restoration of more dialogue at the level of head of state. But we've already got that across civil society through unions, academics, civil society organizations of a number of different types. And that's been very successful throughout the period of the vacuum of CELAC. So the declaration contains a number of important points. From our point of view, we do think it's important that we focus on some of the priorities that are mentioned there, particularly inequality. Latin America is a very unequal region, and we really do need to address inequalities. Latin America emerged from the COVID crisis more unequal than before. And now, of course, the impact of the Ukraine war has compounded the problems. There has been an extreme concentration of wealth in many Latin American countries, and this has a counterpart in the extreme poverty that exists at one and the same time in many, many countries. According to Oxfam's calculations, the average wealth of the billionaires has increased by some 20%, 21% in recent years, whereas 800 million people are living below the line, which is defined as extreme poverty. And this means that there are many situations which are nothing short of ridiculous. In Mexico, for example, one person, the richest person in the country, has seen their wealth increase over the last 3 years by $26 million per day, whilst 11 million people live in extreme poverty. That's just one statistic. And Oxfam, and not only Oxfam, therefore has absolutely embraced the objectives in the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. Let nobody be left behind. And is trying to deliver on that. But the thing is, some people have got so far to come from because they are so far behind, because the society in which they live is so dysfunctional and the region is so dysfunctional. So over and above these inequalities, which are multidimensional and intersect many different aspects of society, there is extreme poverty and there's an extreme disparity in political equality or inequality as well. For example, we did a report on Brazil where we looked at incomplete democracy. And what we meant by that is that there are groups which are underrepresented. A majority of the demography of the country is actually underrepresented. Many minorities are underrepresented. In Brazil, for example, at least 30% of the population is women, and they've got 2.3% of the seats in the parliament. So wealth is hyper concentrated, and power is and political power is hyper concentrated. So there is a monumental inequality, which undermines confidence in the political institutions and contributes to potential crises in democracies. There has to be a response provided by the Global Gateway, and the response thus far has been that we will renew a social contract we have with the region, and the green and the digital transition will make a valuable contribution to transforming productive infrastructure, and this will help us to renew our social contract. Latin America, in terms of the green transition, is in a better situation because it has a lot of clean energy. It has a lot of reserves of critical raw materials, some of the most substantial globally. But it also contains a number of economies and a number of countries which are very dependent on fossil fuels. And this means that there needs to be a big focus on the energy sector. These minerals, fossil fuels, need to be left beneath the ground. But where there is very little fiscal space left to diversify the infrastructure and to generate jobs, it's very difficult for the government to invest in public policy whilst doing that. So that's what we mean by the difficulties of the green and digital transition. It's you have to look at it through a very different prism in Europe from that in Latin America, and within Latin America from country to country. So the Global Gateway has a lot of challenges it has to address, and this is something that we're going to do, we hope, at a bi-regional level. As I've already mentioned, fiscal space, and some countries have very little fiscal space. That means that by the same token, they have less political autonomy to take the necessary decisions. And this limited fiscal space results from systems which are actually defective and regressive and are likely to lead to huge public debt and, in turn, to difficulties in providing a proper response to the COVID crisis and all the repercussions ensuing from that. As Javier López said, we need a proper response to this. We need to restructure debt. We need to think about restructuring economic governance and debt very carefully, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to talk in terms of any sort of strategic autonomy. So what sort of responses can we anticipate from the EU? Should we be able to anticipate? Well, we have the Global Gateway now. Prior to that, we were given the new agenda for the EU some time before that, and it focuses really on a number of the basic issues that Latin America and the Caribbean area need to address. It's actually quite simple in its structure. It focuses on social cohesion, on inequality, on human rights, on investment, and it mentions trade 37 times. So it is clear that the European Union's geopolitical approach to Latin America is focused on investment and on trade, and it's hoping to reposition industry and to enhance competition and drive investment in that way. As my colleague said, there is, of course, a social policy aspect to trade policy, but the region needs a lot more than just public sector investment. Private sector investment can also help to drive the transitions that are necessary, but not at any price. And civil society has concerns, serious concerns, and we're concerned, for example, about the social contract and any renewal of the social contract. What will the price be? A next generation type of Marshall Plan will be a public sector investment in Latin America, but this is effectively foreign direct investment. And what is this going to mean in terms of how it interlinks with the Global Gateway investment? And the second question we have is, how are we going to reconcile this investment, which is supposed to focus on bridges and infrastructure and cables, with the alliance of values based on freedom, democracy, rule of law in societies that are so unequal. There are real inherent tensions here. And the difficulties in, for example, strategic sectors such as mining and telecommunications have to be addressed. We need to deliver transition. We absolutely need to. I will be wrapping up just imminently. They need to be based on transformation of the productive system. They need to generate quality jobs. They need to respect human rights in all the areas where resources are disputed, intensely disputed. And we've seen down the course of recent years, decades and even centuries, that investment in these strategic sectors can actually reprime the economies and restructure it, but it can also simply lead to fiscal and tax advantages for the few, no quality jobs, economic and environmental sacrifices, and huge social problems in these disputed areas. So we do not want to see a replication of that. We therefore need to set down some structure, some conditions, and we feel that the European Union, yes, is committed to multilateralism, but it needs to deliver on these principles in multilateral economic governance, and it needs to structure its arrangements with other regions on the basis of a pact. For example, like my colleague Olga talked about a package for promoting care. In Cartagena de Indias, there are meetings ongoing now where there's actually a focus on trying to bring about some better fiscal cooperation across the Latin American region to try to strengthen Latin America's position globally vis-à-vis other partners. So the investment package of the Global Gateway, of course, is going to be based on technological transfer, because reindustrialization has to take place in both regions. It has to be based on responsible social, environmental policies, on compliance with and respect of human rights, and on trying to close the gulfs that exist in terms of gender rights and law. And it has got to be effective on the ground. So allow me to close with the fact, saying that we've got 35 votes in the UNCR, and we've got 30% of the lithium reserves. We have the green heart of the world in Latin America, and therefore we need to have a proper partnership, and we need to focus on ensuring that we force Carlos Slim and all multinationals to respect human rights, to fight against the culture of privilege and inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much to talk about. And now Professor Fonseca Castro Jorge from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, Department of Applied Economy, Structure and History, Faculty of Economics. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you for inviting me. In particular, I thank the Latin American side that has asked me. I'm an Argentine Spaniard. I'm also Latin American and European at the same time. And I'm here as an academic, really, as part of the human population. That's how I wish to address you today. Now, what we're talking here about is proposing a sustainable advancement of society and moving forward Latin America and the rest of the world. And in order to do this, we need equitable, fair trade agreements that serve the population. Now, this has been quite obvious when we look at how the EU-Mercosur negotiations have developed. But if we compare that to the reality, it's quite distant from what we see there. The treaties that are currently in force, others that are still on the way and in the pipeline, are asymmetrical in terms of the trade relations. Industrialized countries are providing industrial goods, and from the periphery we get the natural resources, and some populations are negatively impacted by this. It may seem obvious. In the European population, the extractive logic. It's beneficial economically and socially, and the food prices and energy prices are being driven up. We've seen this in Spain and elsewhere in Europe in recent times. Now, the Ukraine war may have played a part, but that's just marginal. In Latin America, it's harmful to have this kind of relation because it's reminiscent of the colonial relationships of the colonial past, because the colony was all about this kind of change. It was natural resources being extracted and sent away, and industrial goods that were being provided, whether it's fisheries, mining, or hydrocarbons. It's the cereal exports. Well, what is it? Soy. What's it used for? To feed poor pigs in Europe and in China. That's the main purpose. So what we have is a primarization of the economy in Latin America. And this kind of agriculture that's based on synthetic toxic fertilizers and products and additives and GM model actually uses about 50% of the water that's being extracted and using the resources, and it's producing about mainly animal feed, about 80%. And in fact, the meat that is produced actually contains only about a third of the protein that was fed into it, which is absurd. If you look at the billions of people that are going hungry, and the billions that are suffering from a food shortage, what we're doing is stopping the growing of foodstuffs and driving up inflation and causing food insecurity and causing economic crises in growing nations. Really, it's just an elite market that's being fed. And it's all about the transnational corporations having tailor-made legislation, provided them with special courts that are just functioning on the margins of what's legal, and you people being asked to change their constitutions without the actual electorate being consulted on such constitutional changes. Well, there you have it. And that's all the work of people who are close to the corporations themselves and who have ties to those forces and those lobbies. Well, that's all there in the treaties. It's being used to control the people, to control the markets, through the resources and trade of resources between the US, China, the European Union, and also the Latin American elite, and the global north, if you like, which is, of course, all over the world, including in Europe. We've got mining and oil resources that are being extracted to the detriment of other sectors, with the customs effects and social dumping resulting. And ultimately, it's the traditional sectors that are being swallowed up, and they're being swallowed up elsewhere too in the global south and in the center of the system as well. We're seeing investment, foreign investment, that's high yield, and so we know that in the medium term it's going to replace the investment, and it's going to cause flight of capital, inflation, and tax fiscal crisis. We know this. It's a cycle. We're familiar with it in Latin America, and right now Argentina is living this kind of crisis, but other countries too. So what are the consequences then of these trade agreements, these neoliberal forms of investment? You've got the economic destabilization and the weakening of democracy, amongst other effects. Yes, these treaties themselves are destroying democracy, sometimes in extreme cases leading to coup d'etat in order to replace local people, leaders, in order to keep people in power who support the new colonial vision that's behind it. Now, if you look at the coup against Evo Morales, that was no doubt backed by thinking related to lithium. We know Argentina and Chile and others are in the lithium triangle, where about 60 to 80% of the global lithium reserves are located. Well, in Argentina, in the province of Jujuy, the governor there, Morales, is actually repressing the local population and violating human rights, because no doubt there are some personal interests at stake with regard to the lithium reserves that are located in that province. These imbalances with Latin American trade causes vulnerability and means that it's just a handful of the super rich that can get their hands on all this wealth. And they can dominate the economic system and the political system as a result. Now, public debt and this handle on interruption from the chair.
Professor, 1 more minute. We're a little bit over. Sorry.
Es clave en la dominación política global.
Now, the real consequence of this model of consumption it just plays out in the inequality models and statistics that were presented by Andrea. And there's no coincidence when you look at the level of equality in Latin America. Soy exports for animal feed, destroying forests in order to do this. The droughts, lack of water resources. We're seeing extreme drought in some regions. And the CO2 emissions caused by this. And you have, on top of that, the water consumed in order to extract lithium. The consumption model that all of these treaties fall within cause the deaths of thousands of environmentalists, the natural disasters, mass extinction of different species and disasters, and climate disaster on the global level. And ultimately, it can lead to the extinction of the human species. And 1 million species have been wiped out as a result of this model in recent years. Now, to conclude, this model is quite simply unsustainable. It's capitalism, it's a socio-economic and environmentally unsustainable policy. The current crisis is a crisis of all the past civilizations, of privatization of public goods. Water, air, soil, knowledge belong to all of humanity. And therefore, we must create a model of fair trade, new production and consumption models based on genuine, actual, fundamental needs to sustain human life. Health, education, culture, housing, the provision of water, all of these are basic services. We have to put the human being at the center of policy making, both at the national and international level, which means that you have to return public goods to humanity, return water, healthcare, education, knowledge. All of these are being privatized. Human intelligence is being turned into a commodity. People talking about artificial intelligence. Well, it's not artificial intelligence. It's the sum total of knowledge that's been gathered over hundreds of years. And all of this is being privatized, being appropriated in order to deprive human beings of their work, their own freedom to work and create. And that's why we have to abandon this idea of GDP growth. And I'm really finishing with this last sentence. We have roadblocks, we have traffic jams causing pollution, death, and illness. And that's just one of many consequences. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you for your passionate discussion. And we're going to have some questions now. Let me just clarify, because I think the professor's discussion was about the trade agreements. And we're going to have a discussion following on the trade agreements from our other 2 speakers. If we could ask the questions for the 3 speakers, well, on my left, and anything that didn't have to do with trade agreements. So those questions on trade agreements can come at the end of the other two speakers. So the floor is open for a few minutes each, 2 minutes for each speaker, and very happy to raise your name and maybe even introduce yourself. I can't see any names from this distance. So we do the typical thing. I ask the first question, or is somebody... Or we can just go on and then have questions at the end. Okay. The senator.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I think it's a very interesting opportunity for us to be able to exchange views on our different perspectives on the trade agreements between the EU and Latin America. We're aiming to achieve sustainable, fair, equitable, just trade agreements that generate added value and that improve the infrastructure in the territory in question. The CELAC summit, which took place last week, clearly stated that it wants to see the bilateral agreements and the trade and association agreements to be concluded successfully, to deliver modernization and improvements in the association agreements. We need, of course, to have a critically minded approach to these. As other speakers have said, there is, of course, the association agreement with Central America, with Mexico and Chile, and there is the association agreement between the EU and the Mercosur. All these are pending finalization. The trade agreements and the association agreements are very important initiatives, and of course there's a great concern about human rights and about the environment, about sovereignty, and the whole context of the agreements between the EU and Latin America is that the EU has really tried to look at the parliamentary dimension, civil society dimension, to try to create instruments which will actually deliver for society and really will protect human rights and protect the environment. That's an integral part of the EU approach to the whole Mercosur trade agreement. It's interesting to hear from representatives who have been involved in that, what they think the reception of the counter proposal will be. Of course, there are a number of things that we need to focus on. We have a number of invited guests here, and I think there's some important points that we can look at. What measures do you think we should be envisaging to ensure that the member states in Latin America retain their sovereignty, retain their social justice, that they retain respect for human rights and their own sovereignty over policymaking? So in the light of all these points, I think it's very interesting to hear from Joseph Susu, who's got 8 minutes now to present his remarks to us. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Calimera, President. Obviously, I'd like to express my thoughts for both Greece and Italy and the other Mediterranean countries that are suffering so much from the wildfires that are ravaging the continent of Europe at the moment. I think now it's important that we look at empirical data from the economic and social perspective. It's clear that our world is changing, and changing at an incredible velocity. We didn't ever foresee that we would have the COVID pandemic. We didn't foresee that we would have an energy crisis and a food security crisis, which are jeopardizing the recovery from the pandemic. And indeed, analysts didn't really foresee the shifts in global economy and global trade patterns that we've seen. So we need to look at the economic and social and political implications of all these reports. Some of them have been adopted with unanimity. Marcus Carpato and Rodrigo Brinton, who work with me, were instrumental in drafting Rex 552, which looks at a lot of the aspects of economic recovery post-COVID in Latin America and what we could do in conjunction with the EU. It's clear that obviously in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are implications for sovereignty, and there is clear disinformation which has affected the understanding of in society of the fundamental traditional relationships. This is all very important. It's important that the Economic and Social Committee flag this up. We want to see stronger bi-regional relationships, and we want to ensure that in this global world, people are aware of the fact that, yes, the economic aspects are very important, but social policy and prosperity are equally very important because they underpin the very existence of democracy. So we need to have policies which are founded on the Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which has permeated social life in liberal democracies hitherto. It is so fundamental to our life in society. So this is a model on which we have based our lives for some considerable time. It's true that China's economic development is very fast. It may not be quite as fast as it was, but it's not based on a collaborative model. 70% of world production could quite well be dominated by China, and 70% of the raw materials monopolized by China. And therefore, the solutions which we need to consider very pressingly are quite complex. We've got to work together in full awareness of the facts and the real global situation. And we've got to try to ensure that we forge a bi-regional relationship which enables us to address all the problems that there are there. We want to be able to fulfill our proper role and protect our countries, our cultures, take forward the interests of our citizens at a global level. And civil society has a very important role to play here. Civil society, and of course you represent civil society as members of parliament, can sometimes be marginalized by decisions which are taken by governments. And we have seen that there is a lot of misinformation, and there's actually rampant populism in quite a considerable part of Europe. And therefore, the way to overcome that is to have more accessible information, better transparency, and to ensure that there is much more intersectoral contact in every way possible. It is important that we do this, and also that we try to see how we can communicate better with young people and with those who are most vulnerable. And it's important to get accurate and correct information out there. There are a lot of environmental issues, for example, but we need to communicate clearly on that, and we need to work in a participative way. So we have to bring all the members of society on board. This is something which Europe, I think, needs to realize. Now, the association agreements are complex. It's easy to have economic sales and trade agreement, commercial agreement with a country which is like what China does. But it is much more difficult to have a proper trade agreement with proper dispute mechanisms and environmental and human rights and so forth. But we do actually have a settlement mechanism in the Chile agreement. That's something which is there. And so we could replicate this in Mexico, in the Mexican agreement. And the Mexican minister is actually keen to conclude the agreement. Of course, it has to be seen in the context of relationships and trade agreements that it has with its northern neighbours. So our association agreements are important, but we do have reciprocity agreements. We do have that civil society aspect. We do have that economic and social policy strand to these association agreements, and that's really important. The informal economy is also important because it's where support for the artisan societies can be generated. Think, for example, what's happened in Northern Ireland post-Brexit. Think of the concern amongst SMEs. They're not just concerned about quotas and taxes and so forth. They're actually worried that there are channels for products coming into Ireland from Australia and goodness knows where that are absolutely not regulated according to the principles and rules of the European model. And the Irish community wants to preserve its model, its way of living, its policies, its budgets. And so it has major concerns. And so this, of course, is replicated in the context of many other trade agreement discussions with other countries. And it has to be said, of course, there are major new challenges in the area of environment and social policy too. As my colleague and friend Monica has said, 9 of the 11 ports in the Sugar are actually owned by China, and China owns many irrigation channels. The Chaco Monica does have a female name, but the organizations are to some extent composed of women and artisans and people who are not earning a lot of money. They're quite vulnerable, but they are really going to find that the investment by China comes back to bite them because they're going to be short of water, a healthy environment, jobs, raw materials, and therefore we need to protect civil society and we need to protect the vulnerable groups in society so that these sorts of ravages to society and their way of life can't continue. In conclusion, Chairman, we have some models, consultative committees for follow-up on the draft agreements, and these are mechanisms which, yes, it could be improved, but they do already play an important role because they flag up a lot of important points to the Commission and to the other institutions. And they do ensure that the Commission at least remains committed to continuing to engage with civil society and focus on capacity building. In Chile, over the last 5 years, which includes, of course, the COVID period, we have actually managed to continue to work through the consultative committee. I chaired the European side of it, and it was quite possible for us to work together. Sometimes it was difficult for the trade unions to meet themselves, but they did manage to participate in these fora. If the government was able to identify a digital interlocutor, they were therefore able to accommodate that. The Argentine Economic and Social Committee is a really good organization. It is the counterpart, really, of the European one, and the return to power of Lula in Brazil is another good piece of news. Of course, the ability to exert pressure, concluding, Chairman, in many countries lies in the hands of industry or major corporations, but it also lies in the hands of the trade unions. They can all exert their own pressures, but it's better to have a dialogue and proper focus and proper context on a democratic and transparent basis, which is properly and formally recognized and held within the proper forum. If I could just have a couple of minutes, Chairman, I think that these are the best ways forward. We've all got our own backgrounds. We've all come a long way. I've worked with my colleague Carlos for a long time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And a round of applause for the Vice President.
Vicepresidente del Comité de Seguimiento de América Latina.
Thank you, Joseph. We know that we have some clear ideas along which we can change a direction. Now, I'd like to welcome and introduce you. I know it's difficult. It's very difficult what you do. Marta Scarpato, Central Workers of Argentina from the CTA, coordinator of the trade unions in the Cono Sur region. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My greetings to all the colleagues on the top table and the Bureau. I'm Marta Scarpoto, International Coordinator of the CTA of trade unions organizations in Argentina, and I'm here to represent the Mercosur trade union federations. As Mr. Puccio said, it's like the European Economic and Social Committee is an instrument of Mercosur. I've come to Madrid now, having participated last week in the Civil Society Forum of the CELAC 2023. Now, this forum supposedly had been set aside for civil society, but there were some surprises, I must say. The first surprise was that the participation and presence of civil society was rather diluted by the participation of local authorities and other people. Many people couldn't actually be physically present and were then asked to participate virtually, and certainly weren't able to speak. Now I've come to EuroLat, and I believe and hope that this space where we have parliamentarians who are democratically elected to represent the people, but also to listen to the people and societies, will afford us these opportunities to hold exchanges. We only have a few minutes for these exchanges of opinions on a topic that has really led to a huge debate and many volumes to be written on them. Now, there are a few points I'd like to say, and many of the points that I did want to raise have already been raised by our previous speakers. I'd like to begin by saying that we should dispel any characterization of the Latin American stance vis-à-vis trade agreements that the press are peddling. Now, we know that the workers' organizations are not against association agreement and cooperation agreements with the European Union. The trade union movement has always stated that association agreements are positive and beneficial in the sense that they support it, if they support self-determination and independent development, and that is certainly possible when transparency is respected, accountability is respected, and differentiated and special conditions are applied. And so it's not that economic and commercial trade agreements should be influencing decision-making with regard to economic decision-making by a sovereign state. So yes, trade unions are in favor of trade agreements with the European Union, but they want them to be negotiated in a different way, because they've seen that the way things have been done so far, we have not been able to achieve balanced agreements that are respectful of differences, that seem to condemn the region to be forever exporters of natural resources and prevent industrialization from taking hold, something that's terribly necessary if we ever want to escape the vicious circle that we've been trapped in. Now, so far, what's been done has not shown this to be the case, and there's not any sign of a structural change that would really remove these countries from the extractivist and export-oriented model. It was said very clearly at the CELAC meetings last week. This sudden interest in Latin America is tied to the geopolitical context and the crisis and the war, and more than it is linked to a genuine desire to contribute to social justice and development in Latin America. In the Northern Hemisphere and northern parts of America, we know that things are not always as they seem. We know that the world has changed since the pandemic and that things have not changed for the better. The signs are clear and they are worrying. So yes, it's a good thing to talk about trade agreements, but this can be too simplistic. We can be much more ambitious. We shouldn't limit ourselves to only trade relations, which is of course important. But I think it would be good to return to the original Mercosur mandate, which calls for a signing of a genuine association agreement with two pillars: development and cooperation, as well as trade. Now, we are convinced that we need to make efforts to promote an exchange that will place human development at the very center, and that will focus on social cohesion with full inclusion of women and the full respect of care, work, young people, and indigenous communities. We do believe in the need to protect cooperation in the field of education and vocational training, and always tying this into the needs of the market, labor market, but not subordinating everything to that, because it is about training and educating human beings. It's not just about creating something that will produce goods. We want there to be genuine social dialogue and trade union freedoms, genuine dialogue between workers and employers in both regions. The European Union can contribute to helping develop corporate social responsibility in companies that are acting on Latin American soil. Now, this cooperation would be fundamental and would be of great value, of incalculable value for the workers on both sides in both regions. And, excuse me, I'd like to say that the colleagues from the European Trade Union Federation agree with our position. We have close cooperation on those issues. Now, the real question that was put to us by the top table is one that I'd like to pick up on briefly. What can we do to ensure that trade agreements are genuine, respectful partnerships on an equal footing, and in full recognition of the times that are not the same, and that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all solution for every region, and that each region deserves to draw genuine benefits from the agreement. It was more than 20 years ago when we launched negotiations between the European Union and Mercosur. Both regions were talking about promoting trade, yes, but they were also talking about developing the region through technology transfer. Those were the two guiding principles for the negotiations, and those shouldn't change. Strengthening trade networks that make it possible to trade more goods and ever bigger volumes, yes, but nobody ever said that we should restrict ourselves to one side should limit itself to exporting raw materials, while the other side would export high-value industrial goods. Now, the political level needs to contribute to the strengthening of organized civil society and bring people around the issues that unite us: democracy, human rights, all human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights as well. However, during the course of the negotiations, the Mercosur agreement morphed into something of a pure and simple trade agreement, which lost sight of the political cooperation aspects and other aspects. Now, many productive sectors and social sectors are questioning this on both sides of the Atlantic. To conclude, can I come back to the question, what can we do to achieve a better agreement? In agreements, you have to have decisions on investments and trade, and those need to ensure that there's added value for a region, and that they're not only about extracting resources to export to another region. One part of the wealth that's generated must remain in the region, and it's a responsibility for the signatories of any potential agreement to ensure that the genuine profits are distributed equitably amongst the workers and those who are producing that wealth and that profit. I don't want to talk about the lithium triangle that's been mentioned by others, but in fact, there are social conflicts that are being stoked, and it's rather serious. If we looked at the Jujuy province example that was mentioned earlier, and that's already taking on international proportions. We've heard it discussed in the Inter-American Human Rights Court, as well as other bodies such as Amnesty International that are pointing to the serious violations that are occurring there. Now, transparency during the negotiations. You need accountability and clear access to civil society, including trade unions and employers. All of this will make it possible for the agreements to be fully accepted and owned by the population and take any force out of arguments that would suggest that there's corruption. If we look at the negotiations in Mercosur, we can see that when things are done behind closed doors in an opaque way, without genuine participation, then it should come as no surprise when you get this kind of reaction from civil society. What mechanisms would you have to include in agreements in order to ensure that they are transparent and that there is genuine accountability and involvement of civil society? Well, the negotiation of association agreements shouldn't take place in a vacuum. They take part within a political and social context in each country and in each region, and they're not sealed off from those realities. But quite often, we get the impression that government negotiators, whether they're national or regional, wish for that to be the case, or believe that this is the case. We saw this under Bolsonaro, with Macri in Argentina. At every possible opportunity, the trade union movement, social movements were sounding the warning bell to warn of negative consequences and were ignored. So more democracy, more dialogue and participation with society. This is truly fundamental if we want successful negotiations for economic and trade agreements between regions. These agreements need to be legitimate and enjoy that legitimacy. And that's where the parties have to play a fundamental role. And that's our core demand. Let us make this possible. And finally, can I say a few words about human rights and respect? Let me stress once again, all human rights in regions that are marked by such inequality and that are often under the control of authoritarian regions. Mercosur has been a protagonist in the battle for these rights to be upheld. The Federation of Trade Unions has said that when these agreements the agreements on their own will not suffice when it comes to labor law implementation. And human rights and labor law respect are a basic prerequisite for any trade or association agreement between two regions. Once again, we count on you for your support and solidarity.
Muchas gracias a Marta Escarpato.
Thank you very much indeed, Marta Escarpato from the Argentinian Worker Central Office and the coordinator of Connoisseur Worker Center. That was extremely enlightening, and it's absolutely right. We need to get back to the original core of the Mercosur agreement, which is not just a trade agreement, it's also a development and cooperation agreement. So, of course, there's been quite a lot of overlap in terms of capacity building, democracy, transparency, dialogue. across all the contributions we've heard this afternoon, but I'd like to thank everybody extremely warmly for the presentations that they've made. They've all been very, very valuable, and they've all brought together a lot of different, very important strands of dialogue, which have, to some extent, been the subject of discussion already in some of the EuroLat committees that have met. So now I could give the floor for a maximum of 2 minutes to some members of Parliament. Thank you very much indeed. I obviously can't say very much in 2 minutes, and I think that I've been very interested in the very diverse comments that you've made. Now, trade is always going to happen, whether or not you have a trade agreement governing it. Trade agreements are actually to eliminate tariffs and quotas, or they impose them, or they raise them, or they reduce them. But the trade will continue anyway. The imports will continue anyway. The exports will continue. It'll just be a different level of them, and you don't need the Mercosur agreement to import soya. You can import it anyway. It doesn't have excise or tariffs or any sort of quotas. But if you want to import it to China, then it's not necessarily subject to tariff-free agreements. So, in summary, trade is going to happen anyway. So the point of the agreements is to try to facilitate it. And the European Union has sought to incorporate some other elements into it. It's been problematic sometimes in the context of the association agreements, but to try to analyse what we're trying to do, really, it's useful if you actually look at the key documents. It's important to look at the content of the agreement before you express an opinion on it. That's a fundamental truth of life. You can only actually express an opinion on something about which you are informed. And the Mercosur Agreement is the most modern and environmentally human rights orientated agreement. But there are many people who say that it isn't very acceptable, and that is because some of the countries in the Mercosur group say that they're neo-protectionist provisions. It's not the Europeans who are saying that, but I've actually heard this. I heard it in a meeting recently, and I didn't actually respond. But that is where these charges are coming from. The point is that the attempt is being made to incorporate these protections of rights into the trade agreements. We have environmental and social welfare and labour law protections, and we have ministers who are responsible for ensuring that these protections are enforced. And we have a very activist minister who feels strongly about the protection of the Amazon. But there are, of course, other people who argue that their demands for protection of the Amazon are too high. Sometimes near my home, I would see a poster which was not for everybody when I walk down the street. And that's not actually appropriate here, because trade agreements are not an absolute ill. They're not going to be responsible for killing people, but they're not an absolute positive either. So it depends how people respond to them, how they're implemented, to what extent they're complied with, what the political and economic cooperation actually turns out to be like in the longer term. But you can have the best legal agreement in the world. If you don't have proper legal certainty underpinning it, then it could be exploited by speculation, for example. We're trying to promote constructive investment and develop added value and guarantee investment in public sectors, but some of the countries won't actually have a structure to guarantee that, and therefore we may potentially find that people are identifying areas of investment which are not as they were intended to be under the agreement. Fundamentally, we want to ensure that there's productive investment. The government is responsible for that. I believe in civil society, and I think it's really important that there is civil society buy-in, into trade negotiations. I think civil society is highly legitimate. It may not always be as representative as it might be, but it has a very high degree of legitimacy, and it's very important to bring it into the debate. But the thing is, we are signing agreements as the EU with democracies, and there is democratic scrutiny over what is going on. I therefore wonder about trade agreements and association agreements which are approved in parliaments with elected governments, or people are saying that they are not actually endorsed by the society, that there aren't proper checks and balances, that they are not founded on proper legitimacy, proper respect for the international trade law and principles of sustainability, legitimacy, rule of law, and democratic principles. Thank you very much, Jordi Cañas. Well, it is true that I did point out that we were going to get a list of questions and then we were going to give the floor back to our experts who would have 3 minutes to answer. I did also say that colleagues were only to take 2 minutes to put their question, and I would urge you, please, to comply with that and to stick to your 2 minutes. Inmaculada Pinera is the next one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's great to see you. I met you in Chile, and I welcome you to my city, Madrid. Well, we have this debate on trade agreements, and I think the first point I'd like to make is that we should think about how we manage time better. The meeting with civil society should be for dialogue, and a dialogue where you have some sides talking for 8 minutes and others have 2 minutes isn't really a dialogue. So may I suggest, by way of improvements to the way we run this, if others agree, we should have a different way of dividing up the time, fewer experts perhaps, or more equal division of time between the experts and those on the other side, because that would mean we'd have a more of a dialogue. Now let me highlight a few points about the perception of trade policy. Well, I don't think that you can hold trade policy responsible for national policy. Trade policy, if it's not backed by a strong state, then there are some cases where sovereignty is lost because they don't have the institutions in order to counter potential abuses of international companies and multinationals and others. But if you want a prospering economy that's inclusive and redistributes wealth, you have to have a strong state, strong education system, universal education, universal healthcare. You need to have fair distribution of tax burden, so the taxation system. When it comes to Latin America, you have minimal taxation because there's simply no capacity to gather and collect taxes and to build up public services and national security, which is a basic requirement for a welfare state. Well, the trade agreements will not solve this. If microphone problems. We need to ensure through our trade agreements that the microphone problem, if the we can't hear the speaker well.
Tener una rendición de cuentas, totalmente de acuerdo. Y para eso hace falta información. Y hace falta.
What we need is to analyze the information. Thank you.
That's better.
Well, it's the length of the microphone. Thank you very much. Please just speak directly into the microphone. Thank you very much from the interpreters as well. Yes, what I was trying to say is that we need a trade agreement to be negotiated in a transparent way with information to parliamentarians who should be carrying out the scrutiny work. But if I could make an aside here, I'm a member of the Economics Committee. Yesterday, we presented a report on parliamentary scrutiny of trade agreements, which is precisely what we're talking about here. There wasn't a single contribution from the Latin American side. And the proposal that was made was the Parliament side making a proposal, speaking to the Latin American side. But the European side tabled amendments. I tabled many amendments, and many other MEPs tabled amendments. We had a negotiation around the compromises. There wasn't a single amendment from the Latin American side or a Latin American parliamentarian. So let's change the way we involve people for our reports. It shouldn't be about anyone telling anyone what to do. It should be about involvement. Without involvement, we can't actually be in a position to ask anyone for anything. What we need is better working method, more dialogue. We shouldn't have 6 months for us to speak one to one another. We should use the tools that exist to keep an ongoing dialogue alive, better working relations, and then we should have better results coming from this. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Macuela Rodriguez. I think you've made a concrete proposal which we will submit, of course, to all those who are working with us. Now, can I give the floor to Cecilia Brito from Pala Sur?
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, co-presidents. In particular, can I greet the experts who, in their own way, all provided enriching content for us for our debate. I'd like to make a proposal to the Bureau. I think when it comes to better participation of civil society, we as parliamentarians no doubt have positions that are well informed. I'm left with 2 questions that parliamentarian Fonseca Castro and Marta Scarpato made. They raised some concerns. Before I turn to the EU-Mercosur agreement, I'd like to make this point. Now, in this digital era, there is a very sensitive issue, the idea of privatized intelligence. Well, that is something that we need to look at in detail, because the technology really is violating human rights, and we should be concerned about that. I'm quite convinced that when we signed this agreement between the EU and Mercosur, there was a lack of an in-depth civil society debate involving all sectors. And I say this as someone who is well informed about what happened in 2019 when the signature was put on. There were many questions being raised by society, many people raising their concerns, asking for involvement. Now, that's quite apart from any questions about legitimacy of democracy. Democracy can make it possible for people to express a divergent opinion or to express their views or not. Now, this is a regrettable state of affairs. We feel that the signature was something of an electoralist act, and then having been on ice for 2 years or several years, we're being told that we shouldn't just oppose it, we should be constructive. So even though things are happening very late on in this process, we still want to jump on board. We want to be involved because millions of people's lives are concerned in one of the regions of the world where there's the greatest level of inequality. And we're convinced that this is not going to affect our European brothers and sisters in the same way. We want to work together with civil society to rethink the agreement, one that is fairer, more equitable, and doesn't only talk about trade, because these democracies, which are entirely sovereign in our Mercosur countries, there's never really been any Mercosur country reopening the debate. It's been the European side. But the opportunities have come up now to raise concerns and we feel this is the time to do so. We have to come back to them. We need to look at the issues that remain together with civil society and iron out those problems, ensure that we can guarantee justice for all our peoples. Thank you.
Recordar que
Thank you. Can I just recall that given that we have interpretation service today, we are short on time. We can have 15 minutes now to finish our discussions. I will give the floor to Mónica González from the European side, Julia Perrier from Palasur, then Mr. Soler, and then Miranda Paz, Palasur parliamentarian Carly, and finally Mr. Colmes from the Economic and Social Committee. And this would conclude the public comments before we hand back over to our experts. Mónica González, first of all. I would be very grateful if you can speak. Yes, I'll try and stick to the 2 minutes. Can I just echo all those who've said that this should be a dialogue, it should be a discussion, a forum for genuine discussion. It shouldn't be just about listening to statements. I think the civil society forum should be about listening to everything that's worrying civil society. I didn't hear much about the indigenous people, people living with disabilities and other concerns. I'm interested in real people, real society, people living in Latin America, people living in Europe. So I wouldn't want to restrict myself to simply talking about the agreement, which I hope will be an association agreement for Mercosur. And I do support the idea of regulated trade that's governed by rules. Trade will exist whatever we do. Well, the real question is how we're going to frame that, with what kind of agreement, and that we should have perhaps a new form of negotiation. We could start a new round of negotiations to deal with anything that wasn't covered in the agreement as it was signed. No, but let's be clear, nobody really wants to reopen this. If you're to reopen this, then we're going to have many more years of delays. This is the historic moment. This is where we've made a step forward. Many in Latin America and Europe were in favor of this when really no one was looking at Europe, and they were looking elsewhere to other continents. So let's make the most of the momentum we had. Let's make full use of the evaluation and review mechanisms that exist. Let's listen to civil society. Let's use the Joint Consultative Committee, where civil society can be present, not just the trade unions and business interests, but also civil society working in international cooperation. I am from an international cooperation background. Many people are asking for information on how funds will go towards international cooperation and how those funds are being used, because there's a lack of transparency. Now, it's not always about Europe not being transparent, but because there's just not enough information about the exact way things are being spent under the partnership. So I am in favor of continuing dialogue. Let's keep talking. Let's have a trade system that is governed by rules, and that we can have strengthened cooperation. And of course, I support a bi-regional pact on care work. That's the momentum we want to make the most of now. Thank you, Mónica González, and I'd like to give the floor to Mónica Perrier from Palasur now. Thank you, President. Well, I have a few questions for the panelists, but I'd like to also respond to a few points that have been raised by the parliamentarians. With regard to what Ms. Scarpato said, if we look at labor rights that are being impacted and that are perhaps not covered in this agreement, we're talking about the treaty here. If we look at the new digital platforms and how things are changing in this very dynamic world. I think Ms. Brito already said that, but when the treaty was signed, it was overnight. Actually, no one really knew what was going on. And so we started to try and understand who was behind the drafting of the agreement. We wanted to understand who it was. It wasn't the Parliament of Argentina, it wasn't the Senate, it wasn't the trade bodies in Argentina. It was all being done in a very secretive way. And it just meant that it took a long time for things to surface. Jordi may remember some of this, but it goes back a long way. Well, right now, Latin America, or rather Mercosur, is discussing the treaties, and countries in Europe here aren't happy with it. This may take some time. Now there's been talk of strong states. When we talk about strong states and wanting to impose our ideas, our thinking on how we want to deal with our products, how we want to manage those products that are our products, then you say, well, that's going to be difficult in terms of legal certainty. It's this kind of boogeyman of legal uncertainty that's being invoked every time we try to stand our ground and defend our interests. So the whole issue of trade agreements, we've said this always, and we keep saying this. And finally, some people said, oh, what's the dynamic for work in the parliamentary committee? Last weekend we were discussing and the amendments, and well, actually what happened is we submitted amendments. Perhaps there was one signature missing, or it was 5 minutes late after the deadline. Well, it's rather difficult for us when it comes to presenting an amendment. It's technically difficult for us, and it's more so than for the European side, perhaps. And so that's something that we're trying to improve. And thank you.
I shall try to give the floor to some more of the people on the speakers list, but we really can't overrun, and I don't think that we have time for all the speakers unless you are very, very strict with yourselves. So the next speaker is Mr. Solé. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. I just want to mention one point which I think is relevant, hopefully also interesting, and that is that during this legislature, this Parliament has been very focused, and still is very focused, on trying to promote more equitable and more sustainable, more fair trade, which is more aligned with principles of human rights. Because trade isn't regulated just by trade agreements. There are other standards and pieces of legislation as well. For example, we are working on other directives on forestry, for example, on due diligence, on critical raw materials. And these are also going to have an impact on the extractive industries, for example, to cite just one example. And therefore, there are many other things which may be less obviously related, but they are pathways which are going to deliver positive change. And there will be more that we can do in the future, but this, I think, is a good start, and I think we should recognize this, that we've been working hard during these last 4 years, and that, frankly, some years back, this legislative work would have been absolutely unthinkable. So we've made a lot of progress. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you so much also for sticking to your time. The next speaker is Ms. Miranda Paz, likewise from the European Parliament. Thank you very much. I would like to express my thanks to the EuroLat Assembly for giving civil society, an opportunity to participate in this debate. I know that not everybody's here, but at least a number of people are, and it's very important that we're having this debate in the Senate and that we have a forum which is completely bilateral. I come from an area which is Galicia, in fact, where we have an awful lot of cows, as you do also, I think, in Galicia, in Uruguay. But we also produce milk and oranges, and we produce a lot of agricultural products, but we also have industry. So I would like to hear a bit more about what the impact is going to be for your industry, your farm industry, because the small farmers here are concerned about some of the things which they produce being affected by trade agreements with Latin America because they're afraid of the competition against their products. But it's also important, I think, for us to look at other aspects. We have to recognize that cheap imports can destroy jobs, and that's something people have been concerned about in the context of the Chile agreement. There have been a number of objections to this precise draft of the Mercosur agreement, as my colleague from the Greens said, and we therefore need to address them. And we need to think that if we've got 450 organizations which were represented a couple of weeks ago in the meeting, and they're expressing their concerns, and the trade unions from both regions are expressing their concerns, then something is wrong. In Argentina, in Germany, in Mexico, in Spain, in Uruguay, there are clear concerns. Something is up, something is wrong, and this is a legitimate concern. And the last thing I'd like to say is that I think it's very welcome that civil society is involved, but I'd like to know, how do you think we can increase civil society involvement? What sort of mechanisms would enable greater participation and greater representation in the future? Thank you very much. And the next speaker is our colleague Carlen from the Parla Sur. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Thank you for creating this opportunity and for allowing so much participation. I've been in other EuroLat meetings representing the trade union grouping in civil society meetings, and I very much welcome the opportunity you've given us today. I come from Argentina. Mercosur is 19 billion hectares, 14 from Argentina, and 50% of the people of Latin America are covered by the Mercosur area. My name is Carlen. When my uncle went there, he went because of famine and war in Europe. He went to Latin America. And Latin America remains very close to Europe. And therefore, if we're going to have an agreement, we need to see it in a global context. And we need to see what the impact is for European industry, what it can do for us, what we can do for it. We have a lot of primary products that we can produce, for example, but we don't want to be destroying jobs for our people. We need to be looking to the future to create a better future, economic recovery for our citizens. Latin America has certainly lived through the COVID crisis, but things are improving. Europe has had difficulties too. The Mercosur agreement is very necessary and it's very important to both parties, but there are some important things which need to be borne in mind. There are some products which you are concerned about, there are some which we're concerned about, but it's not always a comprehensive approach that's taken. You don't necessarily, I think, see what the full impact of certain products could be on the Latin American market. In the committee, for example, we've talked about what Latin America can contribute, for example, in terms of critical raw materials and methanol and the green industry, and it's a lot. So I think we could certainly start making progress, looking towards the future and positive, practical projects like that. And I think sometimes we haven't actually focused on such practical initiatives as we might have done. It's easy for you to engage with the representatives from Central America. there were 63 amendments, I think, on projects relating to hunger and Central America. And the manufacturing process is not supposed to take place more than a certain number of kilometers from where the original product is produced, because otherwise it can actually generate too many food mass and too much fuel consumption. So I think we need to be honest with ourselves. There are a lot of implications. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandro Carlin. And I shall now give the floor back to the co-president.
And then we have one more, and then there's 5 minutes because of the translation.
Thank you. Obrigada. Eu vou falar em português. Penso que
Thank you. I'll make my comments in Portuguese because I think we still have interpretation. Now, I don't want to talk about the trade agreements. They're not just trade agreements. They're much more than that. That's the key difference, really, between association agreements with the European Union. Jordi Cañas, my colleagues, and Marc Collard have already made this point. And we have said today that we're working on other aspects like due diligence, the fighting forced labor, which are a major issue. And we are working hard to make the world fairer when it comes to the trades, and that we're not doing business to the detriment of the well-being of others and elsewhere in the world. Now, what I'd like to say, I'd like the debate to be more lively. The way it became lively towards the end, we should have had this lively debate between civil society and elected representatives, and we should have some clear proposals. One proposal was a bi-regional pact for care. Care has been discussed by the Economic Affairs Committee, but also the Social Affairs Committee, and also in the Women's Forum, because the care economy is so big, and because we know that there is an economic price and an equality price that's paid when it comes to men and women. Now, if this is something that comes out of today's meeting, so that we can work together with civil society to establish a bi-regional pact for care, then today's work and the days we spent together would have been worthwhile. Thank you.
Gracias. One more, Senator Colmer from Comité Económico y Social de Europa.
Thank you very much indeed, President, for giving the European Economic Social Committee the floor, and I understand the time pressures, and I will be quite brief. I just want to make 2 points. There is 2 aspects to any agreement. There is the negotiation, and then there is the subsequent monitoring. And I think it's of critical importance that civil society is at the coalface in both aspects of the agreements. Because I would be of the firm view that organised civil society that lives in their communities has to carry back accurate reports back to the communities. And I would make the point very strongly that it's my belief that if there was more involvement with civil society and from the ground up, Brexit would never have happened. And I think we need to keep that message to the fore all the time. Brexit was a fiasco of miscommunication that didn't have enough civil society representation. The second point I would make is, it's said about, and I would make 1,000 if I had the time, I am a farmer from Ireland, and of course I would have concerns. And agriculture, European agriculture, is not against trade agreements. In fact, if they're structured correctly, they could be right. But we are concerned, and strongly concerned, against unfair trade and an unlevel playing field. And we don't have the time and depth to go into it. But the communication piece is of extreme importance unless you want to get sectorial pushback, and we have seen it in Holland and other areas where communities that felt they were disenfranchised and not represented correctly in an agreement had strong pushback. So I'd just like to make those points, and I would like to talk a little longer about it, but this is a very rich discussion, and thank you. It's been a great privilege to be part of it.
I have to be the bad guy and call an end to the meeting. In terms of time, I want the experts. If the experts can do 1 minute, I'm happy to. There won't be interpreters, so you know, I think we'll do our best. The interpreters are free to go. So if that's okay with everybody, those who have problems will struggle. So if we can Corto, how do you say, very short.
Bien, en primer lugar querría decirle al diputado Cañas que respeto, yo creo que precisamente esto del diálogo es importante, respeto sus posiciones ultraliberales, que aquí en España representó el extinto Partido Ciudadanos, y en ese sentido él escuchó su meeting con el mismo, digamos, respeto que también me dirijo ahora a usted. Y le querría decir que respecto a lo de leer, lo hemos leído, pero le quiero decir también que aquí una de las cosas que ocurrió es que no se pudo leer, ni los diputados, ni los eurodiputados podían asistir a leer ese poco democrático. Hablo de democracia, pero poco democrático al marcharse. Eso no es democracia. Eso no es democracia.
No, por favor,
No,
le
eso no es
pedimos
democracia.
también a nuestros
Bien,
panelistas que
en todo
puedan
caso,
responder en general las
En todo
consultas.
caso, lo que quería decir, que el secretismo que ha habido, que los diputados tenían que ir sin teléfono y creo que 30 minutos y no sé si lápiz y bolígrafo para consultar miles de folios, lo cual es absolutamente imposible. Por lo tanto, secretismo es la característica que ha llevado estos esquemas. Y por otra parte, respuesta a lo que él decía, lo que quiero señalar, creo que si me hubiese escuchado, hubiese visto que realmente el problema que hay es que desde el momento de las independencias de América Latina, independencias políticas pero no económicas, cayeron en una situación de neocolonialismo practicado primero por Gran Bretaña y después por Estados Unidos, incluyendo intervenciones militares en toda la región para sostener ese modelo.
Muchas gracias, profesor.
Sí, termino. Por eso, efectivamente,
segundos.
lo que hace falta, indudablemente, es una transformación democrática, radical, que, entre otras cosas, permita de que estos países podamos, y de esos países se puedan realmente mantener políticas soberanas. Hoy eso no es posible, entre otras cosas, porque el Fondo Monetario Internacional se encarga de que la deuda, que se hace impagable y sirva como elemento de chantaje. Reforma fiscal, termino dos cosas, reforma fiscal, pero participación social de la sociedad civil. Democracia significa que los tratados sean aprobados en referéndum por los ciudadanos de todos los países, no por las élites que gobiernan en cada momento.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más de los panelistas? Si no hay más respuestas, queremos agradecer muy sinceramente cada una de las presentaciones con las cuales nos han ilustrado nuestros panelistas y además agradecemos el enorme interés de nuestros colegas también en esta parte de del debate. Respecto de asuntos varios, hay otros puntos a discutir. La propuesta que hacía Inmaculada, vamos a llevarlo a la mesa de manera de poder distribuir de mejor forma los tiempos para la próxima reunión. Les reitero nuestros agradecimientos a cada uno de nuestros panelistas en el día de hoy y le devuelvo la palabra a nuestro copresidente.
Many thanks. I wanted to give some time to you, but I think from what I understood, we stopped. Can I give 1 minute each? Okay. Olga, the women, sorry.
Para ser muy breve, porque
Sorry.
creo que ha habido mucha discusión interesante, muy marcada por los acuerdos comerciales. Yo querría solo señalar que tanto la agenda de inversión de la Global Gateway como los acuerdos comerciales son solo un vehículo, son un instrumento de todos los instrumentos que tiene la Unión Europea. Es cierto que hace 8 años que no ha habido una cumbre de jefes de Estado, pero han habido diálogos políticos, diálogos sectoriales, diálogos de derechos humanos. Y querría terminar por señalar una cosa, porque la cohesión social es importante. Sea cual sea el instrumento y el vehículo que utilizamos, la finalidad sí que tiene que ser la desigualdad, la lucha contra la desigualdad y cómo protegemos los derechos de los que son más vulnerables. Y en esto querría decir que a través de la cooperación, aparte del movimiento de este instrumento nuevo, que es la agenda de inversión, que va a ir en sectores muy estratégicos, hay otros sectores como los derechos humanos, la seguridad, la democracia, que quedan fuera de esta agenda, pero que se van a seguir tratando a través de la cooperación más tradicional o otros diálogos. Y con esto lo dejaría aquí. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Por favor.
Gracias. Y gracias a las traductoras y a los traductores. Tweets. El primero, han estado hablando de estados fuertes y pasando también la corresponsabilidad de los estados latinoamericanos, ¿no? De proveer ese marco regulatorio para que el comercio, para que las inversiones... Estados fuertes, cuando por ejemplo yo daba los datos de México, en el 21 México tuvo que dedicar la misma parte de presupuesto que dedicó a salud al servicio de la deuda. O sea, podemos incrementar el policy space de los estados fuertes para que esas inversiones y esos acuerdos comerciales se hagan en un marco de igualdad, haciendo un esfuerzo conjunto en lo que tiene que ver con la reestructuración de la deuda y la arquitectura de la financiación internacional. Ahí vamos a fortalecer esa capacidad, esa soberanía política, ¿no? Legitimidad y representatividad de los representantes electos, absolutamente, pero pensemos que en muchos países estamos viviendo una suerte de antiextranjerismo y una restricción de derechos y libertades que hace que esas instituciones no siempre pueden ser representativas, no sé si tanto legítimas. O sea, la sociedad civil latinoamericana y también la europea, con presencia en América Latina, está viviendo una situación de ahogo en muchos países. Por tanto, ahí la Unión Europea también tiene que ser una aliada. ¿Cómo mejorar la participación de la sociedad civil? Se está hablando de un mecanismo de articulación que dé continuidad y seguimiento a los diálogos al más alto nivel. Pues ahí que se incluya a la sociedad civil variopinta. Me gusta escuchar que todos los que estamos sentados aquí, que somos tan diversos, nos consideramos sociedad civil. Yo reivindico la participación de la sociedad civil que yo represento. Gracias.
Bueno, en un minuto, muy breve. Yo vengo de un país comunista, excomunista, ¿no? Que era Rumanía, y que ha pasado unas reformas que son similares con lo que va a pasar, por supuesto, en América Latina. Los ciudadanos quieren vivir mejor y hay herramientas para hacer eso posible. Pero la diferencia entre España y Rumanía ahora mismo, y el hecho que 1 millón de rumanos viven en España y no en Rumanía, es que acá hay instituciones que sirven a los ciudadanos y por eso, por supuesto, la gente está acá. Yo también he trabajado en España años antes. Entonces, tenemos que tener una perspectiva proactiva y no reactiva. Muchas veces nuestras autoridades son muy reactivas, que no se puede, que el Fondo Monetario, que otros, no, pero la actitud política interior es muy importante para saber negociar y para arrancar los beneficios que lo tienes en el mercado internacional, en los acuerdos políticos internacionales. O sea que este es el mensaje, vamos a focalizarnos sobre lo que es la agenda ciudadana y ver dónde están las oportunidades, que son los chinos, que son los europeos, que son los japoneses, los americanos, no importa, los rusos, los brasileños, no importa, pero hay que focalizar y hay que llegar con el resultado. Y la institucionalización, la capacidad institucional ha sido el primer paso para modernizar nuestro país en Rumanía y en los países del este. Y por eso yo subrayo que América Latina tiene un gran potencial si va a concientizar que es necesario trabajar un poquito con las instituciones. La violencia en América Latina es un resultado directo de la incapacidad de las instituciones de actuar. Lo que pasa en algunos países en América Central, en Colombia, en Colombia mejor ahora, en Ecuador, en Perú, todo eso es porque las instituciones algunas veces fracasan y por eso tenemos que focalizarnos en este tema. Pero muchas gracias de todas formas, yo creo que ha sido un diálogo constructivo. Gracias, señor presidente.
No, muchísimas gracias. La Secretaría de EuroLat va a anunciar oportunamente la fecha y el lugar en donde se realizará un nuevo diálogo con la sociedad civil y desde ya agradecemos enormemente los aportes, las contribuciones de Olga, Dumitri, Andrea, Jorge, Joseph y Marta, porque han alumbrado y han entusiasmado un diálogo en esta jornada entre la sociedad civil y los distintos parlamentos. Queremos agradecer a cada uno de ustedes por su presencia, por sus contribuciones, a las y los intérpretes que nos han acompañado, al equipo técnico, particularmente a Santiago, a Helmut desde las secretarías que han hecho un excelente trabajo, un agradecimiento especial por la comprensión a nuestro copresidente. Tengo que pasar un aviso económico, los buses van a estar como lo diríamos en nuestros países, yo diría 19:45, otros dirían 8:15, bueno, en el lobby del Hotel Barceló para que sigamos estos diálogos en otro espacio, en esta oportunidad en la Casa de las Américas, y les reitero nuestros agradecimientos por la importante contribución que cada uno y cada una ha hecho en esta jornada. Muchas gracias.